The throne's cold truth. There are few moments in the grim annals of the Great Crusade more fateful than the gathering on terror that would later be called the Council of Nicaea. In the vast amphitheatre beneath the imperial palace, 18 demigod sons of the emperor stood divided, their transhuman voices echoing across marble and gold in heated debate over the fate of psychic power itself. The chamber gleamed with the radiance of 1,000 lumens, yet shadows gathered in the hearts of those assembled, for this was no ordinary discourse among brothers. Magnus the Red stood defiant at the center of the debate, his crimson skin gleaming like molten copper beneath the palace's artificial sun. The Crimson King's voice thundered across the amphitheatre as he defended the noble pursuit of knowledge, the sanctity of the Psyker's gift, the necessity of understanding the immaterial realm that touched every corner of the galaxy. His brother Primarchs listened with varying degrees of skepticism and hostility, some nodding in reluctant agreement, others preparing rebuttals that would shake the very foundations of the chamber. Mortarion's pallid features twisted in disgust as he prepared his counter-argument. The Death Guard's Primarch, embodying the anti-Psyker faction with the fury of one who had witnessed sorcery's corruption firsthand. Jagatai Khan watched the proceedings with the patient calculation of a hunter, while Lehman Russ's savage grin promised violence should words fail to settle the matter. The Wolf King's fingers drummed against the hilt of his sword, eager for resolution through blade rather than discourse. Upon the great throne that dominated the chamber's apex sat the master of mankind himself, golden armor gleaming with power that made the air itself tremble. The Emperor's eyes blazed with inner fire as he observed his son's passionate debate, his face a mask of divine composure that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Yet behind that perfect facade, a mind that had guided humanity for millennia churned with calculations cold as the void between stars. The debate raged for hours, brother against brother, ideology against ideology, while the Emperor listened in silence that grew more ominous with each passing moment. Magnus's desperation mounted as he sensed the tide turning against his beloved libraries and scholar warriors, the knowledge they had gathered across 100 worlds hanging in the balance of his brother's judgment. Then, in a moment that would echo through eternity, warning reached Magnus through channels that should not have existed. Across the vast gulf of space and time, the Crimson King perceived a vision of catastrophe approaching. Horus, beloved war master, standing at the precipice of damnation, corrupted powers whispering promises of godhood in exchange for betrayal beyond imagining. The revelation struck Magnus like a thunderbolt, the implications racing through his enhanced mind with the speed of pure terror. Without thought for consequence or protocol, Magnus reached out with his formidable psychic might, seeking to pierce the veil between terror and distant Davin, desperate to warn his father of the War Master's impending fall. His power blazed forth like a crimson star, tearing through the immaterial realm with the force of a dying sun. The psychic shockwave erupted from his position at the chamber's heart, washing over his assembled brothers with the fury of an unleashed storm. But something went catastrophically wrong. The barrier between thought and reality, already strained by the gathering of so many transhuman minds in one place, shattered like crystal struck by thunder. Magnus's desperate warning became a cascade of uncontrolled telepathic energy, linking every mind present in a web of shared consciousness that none had prepared for or desired. In that terrible instant of connection, 18 Primarchs experienced something that would haunt them for the rest of their immortal existence. Through the psychic link that Magnus had unknowingly forged, they glimpsed the Emperor's unguarded thoughts. Not the careful words he spoke, not the paternal affection he displayed, but the cold calculations that drove his every decision regarding his genetically crafted sons. The revelation struck them like a blade to the heart. Where they had expected to find paternal love, they discovered clinical assessment. Where they had hoped for pride in their accomplishments, they found only satisfaction at the performance of designed tools. In the Emperor's mind, they were not beloved children, but numbered instruments. The first, the third, the fourth, each designated by their legion's numerical assignment rather than the names they had chosen or earned. Guilliman's tactical mind reeled as he processed the stark utilitarian calculus behind every conversation they had shared. Sanguinius felt his noble heart falter as he realized the Emperor's admiration for his angelic nature stemmed not from love, but from appreciation for successful genetic programming. Dawn's unwavering loyalty wavered for the first time, as he understood that his steadfast devotion was valued only for its strategic utility. The connection lasted mere seconds, but those seconds contained lifetimes of disillusionment. Each Primarch experienced the crushing weight of their father's true perspective, beings created to serve specific functions in a grand design, no more cherished than a master weaponsmith's finest blade. They were tools, masterfully crafted and supremely effective, but tools nonetheless. As the psychic cascade collapsed and the telepathic link dissolved, silence fell across the amphitheater like a burial shroud. 18 of the galaxy's mightiest warriors stood frozen in shock, their enhanced minds struggling to process what they had experienced. The Emperor's golden mask slipped for a single heartbeat, revealing something that might have been regret before his perfect composure reasserted itself. Magnus collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by guilt and horror at what his desperate warning had unleashed. The Crimson King had sought to save his family from treachery, only to expose a truth that might destroy them all from within. His brothers stared at him with expressions ranging from fury to despair, each grappling with the knowledge that their deepest beliefs about their relationship with their father had been built upon carefully constructed lies. The chamber trembled as 18 demigods struggled with emotions that threatened to tear their enhanced psyches apart. Some wept without sound, others raged in silence, while still others simply stood paralyzed by the magnitude of their disillusionment. The bonds that had held them together as a family, bonds of shared purpose, mutual respect, and filial devotion, lay shattered around them like broken glass. The Emperor rose from his throne with movements that seemed to bend reality around his golden form. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute authority, yet underneath lay something that might have been sorrow. The Master of Mankind gazed upon his sons with eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the burden of impossible choices, knowing that the unity he had so carefully cultivated had been irreparably fractured in a single moment of unwanted truth. The Council of Nicaea had been meant to decide the fate of psychic power within the Imperium. Instead, it had become the moment when the Emperor's greatest creations learned they were nothing more than instruments in the hands of a god who valued their function above their souls. The galaxy would never be the same, for the bonds of trust between father and sons had been severed by the one thing more powerful than any weapon: the terrible clarity of absolute truth. Shattered illusions. The silence that followed the revelation stretched across the amphitheater like a wound that refused to heal. In that terrible quiet, 18 demigods stood frozen between the men they had believed themselves to be and the tools they had discovered they truly were. The golden light of Terra's artificial sun still blazed overhead, yet each Primarch found himself cast into shadow by the knowledge that burned within their enhanced minds. Robert Guilliman stood as still as marble, his analytical nature struggling to process decades of cherished memories through the lens of this new and devastating truth. The Ultramarine's Primarch had built his life upon logic and order, creating systems of governance and warfare that brought prosperity to 500 worlds. Yet now his perfect recall presented him with conversation after conversation, where the Emperor's paternal warmth had been nothing more than calculated performance. Every word of praise, every gesture of approval, every moment of seeming pride, all of it hollow theatre, designed to maintain the loyalty of a supremely efficient instrument of conquest. The Lord of Macragga's hands trembled as he remembered the day he had first knelt before the Emperor, overwhelmed with joy at finding his true father among the stars. That moment of pure emotion, which had shaped every decision since, crumbled to ash as he realized it had been met not with genuine affection, but with satisfaction at recovering a lost asset. His tactical mind, so accustomed to seeing patterns and connections, now perceived only the cold arithmetic of utility in every interaction they had shared. Sanguinius, the great angel whose presence had always brought hope to mortal and transhuman alike, felt something break within his perfect features. His alabaster skin seemed paler beneath the chamber's light as he confronted the hollowness of his devotion. For so long, he had carried the burden of his legion's flaw while drawing strength from his father's supposed love, believing that even a creature as flawed as himself could earn genuine affection through service and sacrifice. The angel's wings drooped as he understood that his noble bearing, his inspiring presence, his very capacity for self-sacrifice had all been designed features rather than authentic virtues. The Emperor had crafted him to be a beacon of hope, not because hope mattered to his father, but because hope was a useful tool for maintaining morale among the masses. His angelic nature was no blessing earned through purity of spirit, but merely genetic programming condemned with masterful precision. Across the chamber, Rogel Dawn felt the foundations of his existence shift like tectonic plates beneath an earthquake. The Imperial Fist had built his identity upon unwavering loyalty, upon the certainty that duty transcended all other considerations. His fortresses stood unconquered because he believed in something greater than himself, something worthy of absolute devotion. Yet now he discovered that the object of his loyalty saw him as nothing more than a superbly crafted siege engine, valuable for its function, but possessed of no inherent worth. Dawn's jaw clenched as he remembered countless times he had subordinated his own judgment to his father's will, trusting in wisdom and love that had never existed. Every fortress built, every last stand fought, every sacrifice made in the Emperor's name, all of it had been motivated by an illusion carefully maintained to ensure optimal performance. The Praetorian of Terror found himself questioning whether duty could survive the absence of genuine reciprocal regard. In the shadows at the chamber's edge, Lion L. Johnson retreated further into the isolation that had always been his nature. The Dark Angel's Primarch had learned suspicion in the forests of Caliban, trusting few and revealing himself to fewer still. Yet he had believed that his father was different, that the Emperor alone could see past his guarded exterior to the loyalty beneath. The revelation that even this most sacred bond was built upon utility rather than understanding struck him like a blade between the ribs. The lion's green eyes blazed with something between fury and despair as he realized that his careful guardedness had been justified all along. If the Emperor himself was merely another player in the great game of manipulation and control, then trust itself was a weakness that could only lead to betrayal. The dark angel withdrew deeper into himself, building walls that even his brothers would never again breach. Vulcan's massive form shuddered as compassion turned to ash within his noble heart. The Salamander's Primarch had always believed that humanity's greatest strength lay in its capacity for connection, for love that transcended mere biological imperative. His own nature reflected this belief. He was not merely a warrior, but a protector, not just a conqueror, but a builder of communities. The Emperor had seemed to embody these same values, appearing as both father and symbol of humanity's potential for greatness. Yet the mind touch had revealed a being so far removed from human compassion that even the concept of genuine paternal love seemed alien to him. Vulcan's hands, which had crafted weapons and tools with equal skill, now hung uselessly at his sides as he contemplated the possibility that his own capacity for care had been engineered rather than authentic. If his compassion was merely programming, did it still hold meaning? If his protective instincts were designed features, could they still be called virtuous? A sound echoed across the chamber, harsh, bitter laughter that spoke of vindication born from years of suspected betrayal. Perturabo, Lord of Iron, stood with his arms crossed and his scarred features twisted in a grim smile. While his brothers reeled from disillusionment, the master of siege warfare felt only the savage satisfaction of proven assumptions. He had always suspected that the Emperor valued results over relationships, efficiency over emotion. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had endured decades of thankless campaigns, reducing fortress after fortress, while his brothers earned glory in more celebrated conflicts. He had built and destroyed in equal measure, accepting whatever tasks were assigned without expectation of recognition or reward. Now, as his brothers discovered their cherished illusions were lies, Perturabo found himself the only one whose expectations aligned with reality. They were tools, nothing more, and he had known it all along. At the chamber's heart, Magnus the Red remained on his knees, crushed beneath the weight of his own unwitting betrayal. The Crimson King, who had sought to save his family from corruption, had instead exposed them to a truth more devastating than any heresy. His psychic might, turned toward warning and protection, had become the instrument of their collective anguish. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to preserve what he loved most, he had destroyed it beyond any hope of repair. Magnus felt the eyes of his brothers upon him, some blazing with accusation, others empty with despair. He had always prized knowledge above all else, believing that truth was inherently valuable regardless of its nature. Yet now he understood that some truths were poisons that contaminated everything they touched. His warning about Horus had been forgotten, overshadowed by the greater catastrophe of revealed paternal indifference. The Emperor watched his son suffering with eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Whatever calculations ran through that ancient mind remained hidden behind a mask of divine composure. Yet even his perfect control could not entirely conceal the weight of the moment. The unity he had spent decades crafting lay in ruins, shattered by a revelation that had taken mere seconds to deliver, but would echo through eternity. The chamber's air grew thick with unspoken accusation and betrayal as each Primarch grappled with the magnitude of their disillusionment. Some wept without tears, others raged without sound, while still others simply stood paralyzed by the knowledge that everything they had believed about their relationship with their Creator was built upon necessary lies. The bonds of family, which had seemed stronger than adamantium, proved more fragile than mortal flesh when tested against the acid truth of utilitarian love. In that moment, as 18 demigods confronted the hollowness at the heart of their existence, the seeds of future conflict were planted in soil, made fertile by disappointment and betrayal. Each would respond according to his nature, some seeking reconciliation, others demanding independence, still others retreating into isolation or bitterness. Yet all had been changed irrevocably by the knowledge that even gods could be disappointed in their children, and that the deepest love they had ever known was nothing more than appreciation for a tool well crafted and efficiently employed. The Khan's hunt for truth. In the weeks that followed the shattering revelation at Nicaea, while his brothers retreated into isolation or rage, Jagatai Khan chose the path of the hunter. The warhawk of Chogoris had learned patience in the endless steppes of his homeworld, tracking prey across vast distances until the moment of strike presented itself. Yet now his quarry was not beast or rival tribesman, but truth itself, the hidden reality behind 10,000 years of carefully crafted lies. The Khan moved through the labyrinthine archives beneath the imperial palace, like a ghost given form, his enhanced senses alert for any sign of surveillance. The custodians who guarded these sacred halls knew him well, their golden helms nodding in respectful acknowledgement as he passed. They saw only another Primarch conducting legitimate research, not a son seeking evidence of his father's deception. The irony was not lost upon him. He used the Emperor's own trust to uncover the Emperor's betrayals. Deep within the archival vaults, where the oldest records of Terra's history lay sealed in crystalline storage matrices, the Khan began his methodical excavation of millennia. The documents he sought were not the sanitized chronicles available to imperial scholars, but the raw data feeds from observation stations, the unedited communications between long-dead officials, the bureaucratic minutiae that revealed truth through accumulated detail rather than grand proclamation. What he discovered in those silent hours chilled him more thoroughly than the winds of the Altak Mountains. The Emperor's hand could be traced through centuries of manipulation, guiding the course of human development, not through inspiration or leadership, but through carefully orchestrated catastrophes and controlled conflicts. Wars had been fomented to eliminate inconvenient populations. Technological developments had been sabotaged to prevent premature advancement. Entire civilizations had been steered toward destruction when they ceased to serve their purpose. The Khan's fingers trembled as he accessed records from the Age of Strife, revealing the systematic nature of the Emperor's intervention in human affairs. Societies that might have survived the collapse of the Dark Age of technology had been subtly undermined, their leaders eliminated or corrupted, their defensive capabilities compromised through seemingly random equipment failures. The Emperor had not merely waited for humanity to weaken before revealing himself. He had actively contributed to that weakening, ensuring that when he finally emerged from the shadows, there would be no viable alternative to his rule. Each revelation struck the Khan like a physical blow, yet he forced himself to continue his investigation with the grim determination of a hunter following a blood trail. The Great Crusade itself, presented as a noble endeavor to reunite scattered humanity under the light of truth and progress, revealed its darker nature under careful scrutiny. Compliant worlds were not merely welcomed into the imperial fold. They were systematically stripped of cultural identity, their unique developments in science, philosophy, and governance discarded if they did not align with the Emperor's vision. The Khan discovered detailed analyses of planetary populations, coldly categorizing billions of human beings according to their utility as soldiers, workers, or breeding stock. Entire bloodlines had been marked for selective breeding programs designed to enhance specific traits useful to the Imperium, while others had been tagged for gradual elimination through sterilization protocols disguised as medical interventions. The Emperor's vision of human unity was not one of diversity within shared purpose, but of homogenization toward optimal function. As the Khan delved deeper into the archives, he began to understand the true scope of his father's temporal perspective. References appeared to plans spanning not centuries but millennia, with contingencies built upon contingencies in a web of calculation that dwarfed even the most complex strategic thinking of his sons. The Emperor was not merely a ruler planning for the next war or the next generation. He was orchestrating the development of the entire species across geological timescales. The discovery that shook him most profoundly came buried in the deepest security layers of the archival system. Files that spoke of the Primarchs themselves not as beloved sons, or even as advanced weapons, but as experimental prototypes in a larger project, whose ultimate goals remained frustratingly unclear. References to next-generation subjects and improved compatibility matrices suggested that even his enhanced brothers were merely stepping stones toward some greater design that the Emperor had never shared with any of them. The Khan realized with growing certainty that their purpose extended far beyond the conquest of the galaxy. The Primarchs were test subjects in an experiment whose true nature remained hidden even from them. Their victories and failures, their personalities and relationships, even their eventual fates, all of it was being carefully observed and analyzed for lessons that would inform whatever came next in the Emperor's grand design. When his investigation reached its natural conclusion, the Khan found himself possessed of knowledge that burned like acid in his enhanced mind. Yet he was not content to suffer alone with these revelations. The hunter's instinct that had served him well on Shogoris now guided him toward his brothers, who might be trusted with such dangerous truths, those whose shock and disillusionment had not yet hardened into absolute despair or murderous rage. The Khan sought out Sanguinius first, finding the angel in his private chambers aboard the Red Tear, staring out at the void between stars with eyes that held the weight of shattered faith. The Khan's words fell like stones into still water, each revelation rippling outward to disturb new certainties. The angel listened with growing horror as his brother laid bare the evidence of their father's manipulations, the proof that their noble purposes had been built upon foundations of calculated cruelty. Vulcan was next, the salamander's massive frame hunched over the forge, where he had been crafting weapons with hands that shook with suppressed emotion. The Khan's evidence found fertile ground in the salamander's already wounded heart, confirming his worst fears about the nature of their designed compassion. The revelation that even their capacity for love had been engineered to serve specific strategic purposes struck Vulcan like a hammer blow to the soul. The lion proved more difficult to reach, his suspicious nature now elevated to paranoid intensity. Yet even Eljonson could not argue with documentation that bore the Emperor's own genetic markers, files that revealed the careful monitoring of each Primarch's development and the cold satisfaction expressed at their optimal performance. The Dark Angel's green eyes blazed with fury as he recognized the depth of the surveillance network that had observed his every action since his rediscovery. As word spread among these select brothers, carried through encrypted Vox communications and clandestine meetings in the deep void between fleet deployments, the first seeds of organized resistance began to take root. Not rebellion in the traditional sense, none of them had yet conceived of raising arms against their father, but a quiet alliance of those who refused to accept their designated roles as unthinking instruments of an unknowable will. The Khan found himself emerging as the coordinator of their growing network, his natural instincts for independent action making him the perfect focal point for their shared discontent. Yet even as their conspiracy took shape, he remained acutely aware that the Emperor's surveillance apparatus was vast and sophisticated. Their father had manipulated galactic events for millennia. He would not be blind to dissent among his own creations. The first signs of Imperial attention came as subtle shifts in fleet assignments, minor adjustments to supply lines that placed trusted representatives closer to the suspicious Primarchs. The Khan recognized the pattern from his study of the archives, the same gradual tightening of observation and control that had preceded the downfall of countless civilizations throughout human history. The Emperor was moving to contain the damage caused by the revelation at Nicaea, not through force or confrontation, but through the patient application of pressure that had served him well across the centuries. The Khan realized that they stood at a crossroads that would define not only their own fates, but the future of humanity itself. They could submit to their assigned roles, accepting their status as tools in the Emperor's cosmic design, or they could forge a different path, one that honored their own sense of purpose and dignity. The choice would not be made easily or without cost, for defying a being who had guided the development of entire species was a prospect that chilled even enhanced hearts bred for war. Yet in the depths of space, as the Khan's network of disillusioned brothers grew and strengthened, a new possibility began to emerge. They were not merely weapons in their father's arsenal. They were independent beings, capable of choice, possessed of will and wisdom that transcended their original programming. The revelation that had shattered their faith in the Emperor had also freed them to discover what they might become when no longer bound by the expectations of their creator. The hunt for truth had led the Khan to knowledge more devastating than any wound, yet it had also granted him something precious, the freedom that came from seeing clearly, even when that sight revealed truths too terrible to bear. The word-bearer's prophecy. In the depths of his flagship's sanctum, where shadows danced with incense smoke and ancient texts whispered of truths beyond mortal comprehension, Lorgar Aurelian knelt before an altar not dedicated to the Emperor. The word-bearer's mind still reeled from the revelation at Nicaea, yet where his brothers had found only despair or rage, the Horizon discovered something far more dangerous: opportunity. The psychic cascade that had shattered their illusions had also opened pathways in his enhanced consciousness, revealing vistas of possibility that stretched across time like golden threads in an infinite web. The visions came to him in waves, each more vivid and terrible than the last. Lorgar's prophetic sight, always his greatest gift and burden, now blazed with intensity that would have destroyed a lesser mind. The future unfolded before him, not as a single path, but as a labyrinth of choices, each decision point branching into countless permutations of triumph and catastrophe. He saw his brothers as they might become, not the loyal tools their father had designed, but free agents capable of reshaping the galaxy according to their own vision. In one strand of possibility, he witnessed Guilliman establishing a realm of perfect order, his ultramarines enforcing a new code of governance that owed nothing to Terra's authority. The Lord of Ultramar stood before assemblies of mortal humans, no longer claiming to speak for the Emperor, but declaring himself the architect of humanity's true destiny. Worlds prospered under his methodical rule, yet the cost was evident in the cold efficiency that replaced warmth, in the calculated progress that left no room for the messy vitality of genuine freedom. Another vision showed him Sanguinius leading a great exodus, his angelic presence inspiring billions to follow him beyond the galactic rim in search of redemption. The great angel's wings bore the weight not of imperial glory, but of desperate hope, carrying his followers toward distant stars, where they might forge a new beginning untainted by the Emperor's manipulations. Yet even in this noble flight, Lorgar saw the seeds of tragedy, for no amount of distance could free them from the flaws built into their very DNA. The most disturbing visions centered on his brother Horus, the golden son who bore the emperor's favor like a crown of thorns. Lorgar watched in fascination and horror as countless versions of the War Master grappled with the knowledge of his true status. In some timelines, Horus accepted his role as a supreme tool and became something cold and terrible, enforcing the Emperor's will with efficiency that surpassed even their father's coldest calculations. In others, the beloved son turned his charisma and tactical genius toward rebellion, gathering a coalition of the disaffected that tore the galaxy apart in civil war. Yet among all these fractured possibilities, the most frequent visions showed Horus paralyzed by indecision, caught between loyalty and betrayal, love and hatred, duty and desire for autonomy. The War Master's noble heart, which had made him the Emperor's chosen, became his greatest weakness when confronted with truths that shattered the foundations of his purpose. Lorgar saw his brother standing on countless battlefields, his sword raised but trembling, unable to strike either for or against the father who had made him into something greater and lesser than human. The word-bearer's enhanced perception revealed patterns that even his prophetic gifts struggled to comprehend. Behind every vision lurked the shadow of the Emperor's ultimate design, a plan so vast and terrible that even the revelation of utilitarian love was merely its outermost layer. Lorgar glimpsed fragments of a cosmic endgame that dwarfed the conquest of the galaxy, schemes that treated entire species as expendable resources in a war against forces beyond mortal understanding. In his darkest visions, Lorgar saw the Emperor's true enemy, not the alien empires that resisted human expansion, not the chaotic forces that dwelt in the immaterial realm, but entropy itself. The master of mankind waged war against the fundamental nature of existence, seeking to impose order on a universe that tended toward dissolution and decay. The Primarchs were not merely weapons in this conflict, but prototypes for something greater, templates for a new form of existence that might survive the death of stars and the cooling of space itself. The revelation struck Lorgar with the force of divine inspiration. They were not failed sons or successful tools, but rough drafts in a project that spanned geological ages. The Emperor sought to engineer not just the perfect human, but the perfect post-human, beings capable of transcending the physical limitations that doomed all organic life to eventual extinction. Each Primarch represented a different aspect of this ultimate being: Guilliman's organizational genius, Sanguinius's inspirational nobility, Horus's charismatic leadership, his own spiritual insight. Yet the visions showed him that this grand design contained fatal flaws, contradictions that would destroy it from within. The Emperor's utilitarian approach had blinded him to the necessity of genuine connection, the power of authentic emotion that could not be engineered or programmed. In seeking to create perfect instruments, he had ignored the reality that consciousness itself resisted such control, that sapient beings inevitably developed purposes beyond their original programming. Compelled by the urgency of his visions, Lorgar sought out his most beloved brother, knowing that Horus alone commanded the respect and loyalty necessary to either prevent or ensure the catastrophes he had witnessed. The War Master received him aboard the vengeful spirit with the warmth that had always marked their relationship. Yet Lorgar's enhanced senses detected subtle changes in his brother's demeanor, a hesitation in his smile, a weight in his posture that spoke of burdens newly acknowledged. Their conversation unfolded in the strategic chamber, where Horus had planned 100 victories, surrounded by holo displays showing the current disposition of the Great Crusade's forces. Yet neither brother's attention remained fixed on matters of conquest as Lorgar shared his visions, speaking of futures where their family bond became the catalyst for either transcendence or annihilation. The word-bearer's words fell like stones into still water, each prophecy creating ripples that disturbed the careful equilibrium Horus had maintained since the revelation at Nicaea. The War Master listened with growing tension as Lorgar described the paths that lay before them, the choices that would determine not only their own fates, but the destiny of humanity itself. Horus's hands clenched and unclenched as he contemplated visions of himself as either the ultimate enforcer of the Emperor's will or the architect of its destruction. The golden son, who had always served as the bridge between father and brothers, found himself standing at a crossroads where every direction led to betrayal of someone he loved. Lorgar pressed his advantage, speaking of the Emperor's ultimate plan with the fervor that had once been directed toward worship. The word-bearer painted a picture of cosmic transformation that would require the sacrifice not merely of their autonomy, but of their essential humanity. They would become components in a vast machine designed to outlast the universe itself, their personalities and desires subsumed into a greater whole that bore no resemblance to the beings they had once been. The War Master's composure cracked as he contemplated the magnitude of what his father intended. Horus had always prided himself on seeing the larger picture, understanding strategies that spanned decades and campaigns that encompassed entire sectors. Yet the scope of the Emperor's ambition dwarfed even his enhanced perspective, revealing purposes so vast that individual lives became meaningless in their pursuit. As their meeting drew to its close, Lorgar departed with the satisfaction of seeds well planted. The War Master's certainty had been shaken, his loyalty tested against revelations that would have destroyed lesser minds, yet the word-bearer knew that Horus remained balanced on a knife's edge, capable of choosing either absolute submission or total rebellion, depending on how events unfolded in the coming days. The visions continued to flow through Lorgar's consciousness as he returned to his own fleet, each new revelation adding depth and detail to the tapestry of possibility he had witnessed. He saw the choice approaching like a storm on the horizon, a moment when the Primarchs would be forced to declare their ultimate allegiance, either accepting their designed purpose or forging a new destiny written in their own hands. In that moment of decision, Lorgar understood that the revelation at Nicaea had been merely the beginning. The true test lay ahead, when knowledge would be transformed into action, and the sons of the Emperor would discover whether their bonds of brotherhood were strong enough to survive the truth of their creation. The galaxy hung in the balance, waiting for demigods to choose between the slavery of design and the terrible freedom of authentic choice. The iron cage of logic. The confrontation came not in the heat of battle or the passion of sudden fury, but in the cold sterility of a strategium chamber aboard the Iron Blood, where two brothers met to discuss the future of their fractured brotherhood. Perturabo had requested the meeting with characteristic directness, his message to Rogel Dawn containing only coordinates and a time. The Lord of Iron waited among the tactical displays and siege projections that had become his constant companions, surrounded by the mechanical precision that had defined his existence since the moment of his creation. Dawn arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his yellow armor gleaming under the harsh lumens as he entered the chamber, with the measured stride of one who had never retreated from duty or truth. The Praetorian of Terror carried himself with the same unwavering dignity that had marked him since his discovery on Inwit. Yet careful observation would have revealed subtle changes, a tension in his shoulders, a weight in his gaze that spoke of burdens newly acknowledged and foundations shaken. The Iron Warrior's Primarch gestured toward the strategic table that dominated the chamber's center, its surface alive with holographic representations of fleet movements and planetary dispositions. Yet neither brother's attention focused on matters of conquest or defense as they faced each other across the glowing display. The real battlefield lay not in the void between stars, but in the philosophical gulf that separated their responses to the revelation that had shattered their understanding of themselves. Perturabo spoke first, his voice carrying the same measured cadence he used when explaining siege calculations or fortress vulnerabilities. The Lord of Iron had always possessed a talent for reducing complex problems to their essential components, stripping away emotion and sentiment to reveal the brutal mathematics underneath. Now he applied that same analytical precision to their current crisis, laying out his conclusions with the inexorable logic that had made him the master of siege warfare. "We are what we were designed to be," Perturabo stated, his scarred features betraying no hint of the emotional turmoil that had consumed their other brothers. Tools of transcendent capability, created for specific purposes within a grand design that spans millennia. The revelation at Nicaea changed nothing of our essential nature. It merely stripped away the comfortable illusions that prevented us from seeing ourselves clearly. We can rage against this truth, or we can embrace it and discover what we might accomplish when freed from the burden of false expectations. Dawn's response came after a long moment of contemplation, his words chosen with the same care he applied to the placement of defensive fortifications. The Praetorian's belief in duty had been the cornerstone of his existence since his earliest memories on Inwit, a faith so absolute that it had never required justification or explanation. Yet now he found himself forced to articulate principles that had always seemed as natural and inevitable as breathing. "Honor is not a luxury to be discarded when inconvenient," Dawn replied, his voice carrying the weight of unshakable conviction. "Duty without respect is mere slavery dressed in noble words. If we are nothing more than instruments in our Father's hands, then our service becomes meaningless, not because it lacks effectiveness, but because it lacks the dignity that transforms obligation into honor. A tool cannot choose loyalty. Only a thinking being can make that sacrifice meaningful." The philosophical battle lines drawn by their opening statements would have been clear to any observer capable of understanding the depths of their disagreement. Perturabo represented the path of pragmatic acceptance, the cold logic that embraced truth regardless of its emotional cost. Dawn embodied idealistic resistance, the refusal to abandon principles even when those principles had been built upon foundations of deception. Perturabo leaned forward, his hands pressing against the table's edge as he marshaled his arguments with the same methodical precision that had reduced 1,000 fortresses to rubble. The Iron Warrior's mind was a vast, calculating engine, capable of processing variables and outcomes with inhuman speed and accuracy. Yet now he turned that formidable intellect toward the task of convincing his brother that acceptance was not defeat, but liberation. "Consider the mathematics of our situation," Perturabo continued, his voice gaining intensity as he warmed to his theme. "We are beings of transcendent capability, operating within a framework designed by an intelligence that has guided humanity's development for 10,000 years. Our Father's utilitarian perspective does not diminish our achievements, it explains them. We have conquered worlds and united scattered humanity, not despite our designed nature, but because of it. Why should we mourn the loss of illusions that only limited our potential?" The Lord of Iron gestured toward the holographic displays surrounding them, each one showing another triumph of planning and condemned. His campaigns had been models of efficiency, achieving maximum strategic gain with minimal resource expenditure. Yet where once he might have felt satisfaction at these accomplishments, now he saw only the elegant functioning of perfectly calibrated instruments. "We can build something greater than the Emperor's vision," Perturabo declared, his scarred features lighting with something that might have been enthusiasm. "Free from the need to maintain comforting lies about love and family, we can focus on what truly matters, the advancement of human capability and the conquest of entropy itself. We are the next step in evolutionary development, beings capable of rational thought, unclouded by emotional attachment. That is not a curse to be lamented, but a gift to be embraced." Dawn listened with the patience of one who had spent decades defending positions against impossible odds, weighing each argument with the same care he devoted to evaluating siege tactics. Yet where Perturabo saw liberation through acceptance, the Praetorian of Terra perceived only the path toward a different kind of slavery, one that dressed bondage in the language of efficiency and called degradation by the name of evolution. "You speak of rationality as if emotion were weakness rather than strength," Dawn replied, his voice carrying quiet authority that had commanded respect across 100 battlefields. "Yet what gave meaning to our campaigns was not their efficiency, but their purpose, the belief that we served something worthy of our sacrifice. Strip away that meaning, and our conquests become nothing more than the functioning of a vast machine. Where is the honor in being a component, regardless of how perfectly designed?" The Praetorian's hands clenched into fists as he contemplated the implications of his brother's philosophy. Dawn had built his identity upon the foundation of service to ideals greater than himself, principles that transformed duty from burden into privilege. Yet Perturabo's logic threatened to reduce those sacred obligations to mere programming, making devotion indistinguishable from compulsion. "Loyalty that is commanded is not loyalty at all," Dawn continued, his voice growing stronger as he articulated beliefs that had never before required defense. "It is merely obedience, dressed in noble language. True loyalty requires choice, the freedom to reject as well as accept. If we are nothing more than instruments, then our service becomes meaningless, regardless of its effectiveness. Better to fail while maintaining dignity than to succeed as slaves to our own design." Their philosophical conflict began to draw other voices into the debate, as word of the meeting spread through encrypted channels among the Primarch fleets. Guilliman's analytical mind found merit in both positions, recognizing the practical advantages of Perturabo's approach, while sympathizing with Dawn's concern for honor and dignity. The Lord of Ultramar found himself caught between competing loyalties, his admiration for efficiency, and his belief in principles that transcended mere functionality. Vulcan's compassionate nature recoiled from Perturabo's cold logic, yet he could not deny the brutal accuracy of the Iron Warrior's analysis. The Salamander's Primarch struggled with questions that struck at the heart of his identity. If his capacity for love had been engineered rather than authentic, did it still possess moral worth? Could programmed compassion still be called virtue? The Khan observed the debate with the detached interest of one who had already chosen his path. Jagatai's investigation had revealed truths that went beyond questions of acceptance or resistance, showing him patterns of manipulation that rendered such philosophical debates irrelevant. Yet even he recognized the importance of the conflict unfolding between his brothers, understanding that their choice would determine the shape of any resistance that might emerge. As the debate raged across void-separated fleets, Perturabo and Dawn found themselves becoming symbols of competing philosophies rather than individuals arguing their convictions. The Iron Warrior represented the harsh clarity that came from accepting uncomfortable truths, while the Praetorian embodied the stubborn nobility that refuse to abandon ideals even when they prove to be built upon lies. Their conflict reached its climax when Dawn posed the question that cut to the heart of their disagreement. "If we are nothing more than tools," the Praetorian asked, his voice carrying the weight of ultimate challenge, "then what separates us from any other weapon in our father's arsenal? Where is the line between sophisticated instrument and thinking being? At what point does functionality become indistinguishable from slavery?" Perturabo's response revealed the fundamental gulf that separated their worldviews. "The separation you seek does not exist," he replied with brutal honesty. "We are sophisticated instruments that happen to think. Our consciousness is simply another engineered capability, no more sacred than our enhanced strength or tactical genius. The question is not whether we are slaves, but whether we will be efficient ones or bitter ones. I choose efficiency." The silence that followed this exchange stretched between them like a chasm that no bridge could span. In that moment, both brothers realized that their argument had accomplished something neither had intended. It had revealed philosophical differences so fundamental that reconciliation was impossible. They could work together when necessity demanded, could coordinate their actions in service of shared goals, yet they would never again view each other with the simple trust that had once bound them as brothers. Dawn departed without further words, his yellow armor disappearing into the corridor beyond as he returned to his own fleet and the difficult task of maintaining loyalty to principles that seemed increasingly isolated in a galaxy of harsh pragmatism. Perturabo remained in his strategium, surrounded by the tactical displays that had become his only reliable companions, contemplating the elegant mathematics of a universe where sentiment yielded to logic and emotional attachment became obsolete. The iron cage had been built not of metal and stone, but of competing philosophies, trapping both brothers within worldviews that admitted no compromise. Their conflict had become a microcosm of the larger schism forming among the Primarchs, a fracture that would ultimately prove more devastating than any external enemy, for it struck at the bonds of trust and understanding that had made them more than the sum of their individual capabilities. The Angels' Fall. The golden halls of the Imperial Palace had witnessed many momentous encounters throughout the Great Crusade, yet none carried the weight of inevitability that marked Sanguinius's return to Terra. The great angel's arrival went unannounced by fanfare or ceremony, his crimson ship slipping into orbit with the quiet grace that had always characterized his movements. Word of his presence spread through the palace corridors like ripples across still water, carried by whispers that spoke of the angel's changed demeanor and the shadows that now seemed to follow in the wake of his alabaster wings. Sanguinius walked the familiar pathways of his father's domain with steps that had lost their lightness, each footfall echoing through chambers where he had once brought hope and inspiration to mortal and transhuman alike. The courtiers and administrators who lined his path fell silent as he passed, instinctively recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their beloved angel. Where once his presence had lifted spirits and inspired devotion, now there lingered an aura of profound melancholy that spoke of innocence lost and faith tested beyond endurance. The custodians who guarded the approaches to the throne room greeted him with their customary respect, yet even these enhanced warriors seemed subdued by the gravity that surrounded the angel's passage. Their golden armor gleamed in the palace's artificial light as they stood aside, granting access to one who had never before needed to request an audience with their master. The great doors swung open with ponderous majesty, revealing the vast chamber beyond where the master of mankind held court over the greatest empire in human history. The emperor sat upon the golden throne in all his terrible glory, his form radiating power that made the very air shimmer with barely contained energy. Yet for the first time in his long existence, Sanguinius looked upon his father and felt no warming of his heart, no stirring of the deep love that had once defined their relationship. The revelation at Nicaea had stripped away the veils of affection and sentiment, leaving only the stark reality of function and design, where once there had been the sacred bond between creator and beloved creation. The throne room stretched between them like a vast gulf, its marble floors reflecting the light of 1,000 lumens, yet seeming somehow dimmed by the weight of unspoken truths. Sanguinius advanced with measured steps, his wings folded against his shoulders, and his perfect features composed in a mask of nobility that concealed the turmoil beneath. The angel who had inspired billions across the galaxy now found himself struggling to maintain composure in the presence of the being he had once loved above all others. "My son," the Emperor spoke, his voice carrying the same paternal warmth that had once filled Sanguinius with joy beyond measure. Yet now the angel heard only performance in those carefully modulated tones, the skillful manipulation of vocal patterns designed to evoke specific emotional responses. The words that had once been balm to his spirit now struck him like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of the vast deception that had shaped his entire existence. Sanguinius stood before the throne, with wings spread wide, no longer in gesture of supplication or reverence, but as a statement of his own dignity and worth. The angel's voice, when it came, carried none of its usual musical quality, but spoke with the harsh clarity of one who had looked into the abyss of truth and found it staring back. The words he had come to speak had been rehearsed during the long journey from distant battlefields, yet now they seemed inadequate to express the magnitude of his disillusionment. "Father," Sanguinius began, the title carrying bitter weight as it passed his lips. "I have come seeking understanding of what we discovered at Nicaea. Not explanation or justification, but the truth about what you truly think of those you call your sons. We felt your mind in that moment of connection, saw ourselves as you see us, not as children to be loved, but as instruments to be employed. I would know if there was ever genuine affection in your heart for any of us, or if even that was merely another tool in your vast design." The Emperor's golden gaze fixed upon his son with intensity that would have burned lesser beings to ash, yet beneath that terrible scrutiny lay something that might have been genuine emotion. For a moment that stretched between heartbeats, the master of mankind seemed almost mortal, a being capable of doubt and regret, rather than the perfect calculating machine his revelation had suggested. Yet when he spoke, his words carried the same cold logic that had shaped the conquest of a galaxy. "Love, as mortals understand it, is an evolutionary artifact," the Emperor replied, his voice maintaining perfect composure despite the weight of what he revealed. "A biochemical imperative designed to ensure the survival of offspring long enough to propagate the species. I transcended such limitations eons ago, yet I recognized the necessity of replicating its effects to ensure optimal performance from my created sons. What you experienced was not deception, but efficiency, the application of carefully calibrated stimuli to produce desired behavioral outcomes." The word struck Sanguinius with the force of a thunderbolt, yet he had steeled himself for such revelations during his journey to Terra. What wounded him more deeply was the casual dismissal of emotions that had given meaning to his entire existence. The angel's perfect features remained composed as he absorbed the implications of his father's admission, yet those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle signs of devastation, the slight tremor in his wings, the tightening around his eyes that spoke of pain beyond physical endurance. Then every moment of warmth, every gesture of pride, every instance of what I believed was paternal love, Sanguinius said, his voice carrying quiet devastation, was nothing more than behavioral conditioning designed to maximize my utility as a weapon. The joy I felt at your approval, the comfort I drew from your presence, the very foundation upon which I built my identity, all of it was engineered response to calculated stimuli. The Emperor's expression remained unchanged as he confirmed his son's worst fears with the same clinical detachment that had marked his explanation of love's irrelevance. Yet Sanguinius pressed forward, driven by desperate need to understand the full scope of his father's manipulation. The angel's questions cut to the heart of identity itself, seeking to comprehend whether any aspect of his nature could be considered authentic rather than programmed. Even my nobility, my capacity for inspiration, my ability to kindle hope in others, Sanguinius continued, his voice growing stronger despite the devastation of his father's revelations. These too were designed features, carefully calibrated to serve specific strategic purposes. My angelic appearance, my charismatic presence, my instinctive understanding of what mortals need to hear, none of it arose from genuine virtue, but from genetic programming as precise as any weapon's targeting system. The Emperor nodded with the same measured acknowledgement he might have given to a tactical assessment or resource allocation report. His next words revealed depths of manipulation that dwarfed even the angel's worst imaginings, exposing layer upon layer of engineered response that had shaped not only Sanguinius's actions, but his very conception of self. The master of mankind spoke of inspiration as if it were ammunition, of hope as if it were merely another logistical consideration in the vast machinery of conquest. Your angelic nature serves multiple functions within the strategic framework of the Great Crusade, the Emperor explained with devastating clinical precision. Inspiration maintains morale among mortal populations during extended campaigns. Your capacity for noble self-sacrifice provides an example that encourages similar behaviors in subordinates. Your appearance and demeanor generate the precise psychological responses necessary to maintain compliance and enthusiasm among diverse human populations. These are not flaws in your design, but its greatest successes. For the briefest moment, something flickered across the Emperor's perfect features, a shadow that might have been regret or perhaps simply calculation of the conversation's potential consequences. The master of mankind had ruled for millennia through careful manipulation of perception and emotion, yet now he found himself revealing truths that threatened to destroy the very foundations of his son's identity. Whether that revelation stemmed from genuine feeling or merely strategic assessment remained unclear even to his enhanced perception. There was a time, the Emperor said, his voice carrying a subtle change that Sanguinius's enhanced senses detected despite its subtlety, when I believed it might be possible to feel toward you and your brothers something approaching what mortals call paternal affection. Yet such emotions proved counterproductive to the necessities of your deployment and development. Sentiment clouds judgment, personal attachment compromises strategic thinking. I chose efficiency over indulgence, results over emotional satisfaction. The admission struck Sanguinius as perhaps more devastating than outright denial would have been. To learn that love had been possible, but deliberately rejected in favor of cold utility, suggested depths of emotional amputation that horrified the angel more than simple incapacity would have. His father had not been unable to love, but had chosen not to love, calculating that such feelings would interfere with the optimization of his created sons. Sanguinius felt something break within his perfect heart as the full magnitude of his isolation became clear. He had been created by a being capable of love, but deemed unworthy of receiving it, not through any failure of his own, but through the cold arithmetic of strategic necessity. The angel who had inspired countless billions across the galaxy discovered that he himself had never inspired anything more than calculated approval from the one being whose love he had most desired. Yet even in the depths of this revelation, the Emperor's mask slipped for one revealing instant. Perhaps it was the sight of his most beloved son's wings drooping with the weight of shattered faith, or perhaps it was some vestigial echo of what he might once have felt before necessity demanded its sacrifice. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, something resembling genuine regret flickered across the master of mankind's features before his perfect composure reasserted itself. The necessities of what must be accomplished leave little room for the luxuries of emotional attachment, the Emperor said, his voice returning to its previous clinical tone. You were created to serve specific functions within a cosmic framework that extends far beyond individual satisfaction or happiness. That you have performed those functions flawlessly is a testament to the precision of your design, not grounds for expecting rewards that would compromise your continued effectiveness. Sanguinius stood in silence for long moments, absorbing the finality of his father's words and the complete absence of any hope for genuine connection. The angel's noble bearing remained intact, despite the devastation within, his dignity uncompromised, even as his faith lay in ruins around him. When he finally spoke, his words carried the quiet authority of one who had looked into the heart of ultimate truth and found it wanting. Then I understand at last the nature of our relationship, Sanguinius said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conclusion. I am a tool that happens to think, a weapon that has mistaken its programming for authentic emotion. Yet even tools may choose how they respond to the revelation of their true nature. You have freed me from the burden of seeking love that was never possible and approval that meant nothing when given. The angel turned away from the throne with movements that carried finality beyond any ceremony of departure. His wings spread wide as he walked toward the chamber's exit, no longer symbols of divine inspiration, but banners of independence from a creator who valued function over affection. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the vast space like a funeral march for illusions that had died beneath the harsh light of unwanted truth. As the great doors closed behind Terra's fallen angel, the Emperor remained motionless upon his golden throne, surrounded by the instruments of power that had conquered a galaxy, yet proven incapable of bridging the gulf between creator and creation. Whether the master of mankind felt anything approaching regret for the conversation that had just concluded remained locked behind features that revealed nothing of the calculations proceeding within that ancient mind. The seeds of rebellion had been planted not in anger or ambition, but in the terrible clarity that came from understanding exactly how little one meant to those who claimed authority over destiny itself. The Salamander's Forge. The volcanic peaks of Nocturne had witnessed many gatherings throughout the Great Crusade, yet none carried the weight of destiny that marked the secret conclave called by Vulcan in the shadow of Mount Deathfire. The Salamander's Primarch had chosen his homeworld not for its strategic value or defensive capabilities, but for the symbolism it represented, a place where raw elements were transformed through fire and will into something greater than their component parts. As his brother's ships descended through the ash-laden atmosphere, Vulcan hoped that the same transformative power might forge unity from the fractured bonds of their brotherhood. The great forge hall where Vulcan had first learned the craftsman's art had been expanded to accommodate beings of their stature, its vaulted ceiling soaring high above anvils that had shaped weapons for the Great Crusade's greatest victories. Yet now the tools of creation stood cold and unused as 7 Primarchs gathered around a circular table wrought from rare metals that gleamed like captured starlight. The symbolism was not lost on any present. They sat as equals, with no elevated position to suggest hierarchy or dominance. Sanguinius arrived bearing the weight of his recent confrontation with the Emperor, his alabaster wings folded tight against his shoulders, and his perfect features marked by shadows that spoke of faith destroyed. The angel's presence brought no light or inspiration to the gathering, for the source of his nobility had been revealed as mere programming, leaving him questioning whether any aspect of his nature could be considered authentic rather than designed. Dawn came in full panoply of war, his yellow armor bearing fresh battle damage from campaigns that had taken on new meaning since the revelation at Nicaea. The Praetorian's unwavering loyalty had been shaken to its foundations, yet he remained committed to principles of honor and duty, even when those principles had been built upon foundations of deception. His presence at the conclave represented not agreement with its purpose, but dedication to hearing all perspectives before choosing his final path. The Khan attended with the wariness of one who had already seen too much truth for comfort, his investigation having revealed layers of manipulation that extended far beyond their personal relationships with the Emperor. Jagatai's knowledge of their father's millennia-spanning deceptions colored his perception of every proposal for reconciliation, making him skeptical of any solution that failed to address the fundamental nature of their exploitation. Russ came bearing the scent of distant battlefields and the manner of one whose patience had reached its limits. The Wolf King's savage nature recoiled from the carefully reasoned arguments of his more diplomatic brothers, preferring direct action to endless philosophical debate. His presence at the conclave represented the growing faction that favored immediate and decisive response to their father's betrayal. Ferrus Manus attended with mechanical precision, his iron hands folded before him as he calculated the odds of successful reconciliation against the mathematical certainties of continued conflict. The Gorgon's analytical mind had processed the implications of their revelation with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to all strategic problems, leaving him coldly certain that accommodation was possible if approached with sufficient logic. Vulcan stood before his assembled brothers not as their superior, but as one seeking to build bridges across gulfs that seemed to widen with each passing day. The salamander's massive frame radiated the patient strength that had made him beloved among mortals and Astartes alike. Yet even his enhanced senses could detect the tension that crackled between his brothers like electricity before a storm. The craftsman who had shaped metal and men with equal skill now faced the greatest challenge of his existence, forging unity from elements that seemed fundamentally incompatible. "My brothers," Vulcan began, his voice carrying the warmth that had always marked his words, "we gather in this place not to kindle the fires of war, but to forge understanding from the raw materials of our shared crisis. The revelation at Nicaea has wounded us all, yet wounds can heal if properly tended. We must not allow the Emperor's utilitarian perspective to blind us to the bonds that still exist between us, connections that transcend whatever design parameters governed our creation." The salamander's words fell into silence that stretched like molten metal cooling in the forge's embrace. Each brother processed his appeal according to their nature, weighing hope against experience, possibility against probability. Yet even before the first response came, subtle signs revealed the depth of division that separated them. Russ's barely concealed sneer, the Khan's skeptical posture, Sanguinius's hollow gaze that suggested faith beyond recovery. Ferrus Manus spoke first, his mechanical voice carrying the precision that marked all his communications. "Unity requires common purpose," the Gorgon stated with analytical clarity. "Our current crisis stems from conflicting responses to identical information. If we are to forge cooperation from discord, we must first establish whether our fundamental goals remain compatible despite the revelation of our designed nature." The Iron Hand's Primarch laid out his assessment with methodical thoroughness, cataloguing the various responses their brothers had displayed since Nicaea. Some sought reconciliation with the Emperor, despite understanding his true perspective. Others demanded independence regardless of consequences, while still others retreated into isolation or philosophical debate. The mathematical reality was stark. Too many variables, too few constants, minimal probability of convergent solution. Dawn responded with characteristic directness, his voice carrying the weight of principles tested against uncomfortable truths. Honor cannot coexist with the knowledge that our service means nothing beyond its utility, the Praetorian declared. Yet neither can honor be maintained through rebellion against legitimate authority, regardless of that authority's emotional limitations. We face a contradiction that cannot be resolved through compromise. Either we accept our status as sophisticated instruments, or we reject the entire framework that created us. The Imperial Fist's words cut to the heart of their dilemma with surgical precision. Their father's revelation had created an impossible choice: submit to utilitarian exploitation or rebel against the being who had given them existence itself. Middle ground seemed logically impossible when the fundamental premises of their relationship had been revealed as false from the beginning. Sanguinius stirred from his contemplative silence, his voice carrying the weight of recent devastation. "The question that haunts me," the angel said, each word carefully chosen, "is whether our capacity for honor, love, and brotherhood represents authentic virtue or merely sophisticated programming. If compassion was designed into us for strategic purposes, does it still possess moral worth? Can engineered nobility be called true nobility? Or does its artificial origin invalidate any claim to authenticity?" The angel's query struck at the existential core of their crisis, raising questions that transcended mere political or strategic considerations. If their highest virtues were revealed as designed features rather than authentic developments, what separated them from any other weapon in their father's arsenal? Where was the line between sophisticated programming and genuine consciousness, between engineered response and authentic choice? Vulcan felt the weight of his brother's philosophical crisis as keenly as any physical blow, recognizing that his attempt to forge unity was encountering obstacles more fundamental than mere disagreement. The revelation at Nicaea had not simply damaged their relationship with the Emperor, but had called into question the very nature of their existence as thinking beings. How could they find common ground when the ground itself shifted beneath their feet? Perhaps, Vulcan suggested, with the careful hope of one who refused to abandon possibility despite overwhelming evidence, the question of authenticity is less important than the question of choice. Whether our capacity for connection was designed or evolved, we still experience it as real. Whether our brotherhood was programmed or developed naturally, it still shapes our decisions and defines our relationships. We can choose to honor what exists between us, regardless of its origins. The Salamander's appeal to pragmatic acceptance of their emotional reality found mixed reception among his gathered brothers. Some nodded with grudging acknowledgement of his logic, recognizing that philosophical purity might be a luxury they could no longer afford. Others remained unconvinced, their enhanced minds unable to accept the validity of feelings that had been revealed as carefully calibrated responses to designed stimuli. Russ exploded into motion with characteristic suddenness, his massive frame rising from the forge-wrought chair as raw emotion overwhelmed diplomatic restraint. "Enough of this endless talk," the Wolf King snarled, his savage features twisted with frustration that had been building since the first revelation. "We debate the authenticity of our feelings, while our Father treats us like weapons to be maintained and deployed. Whether our brotherhood is real or programmed matters less than whether we have the courage to claim our own destinies." The wolf's outburst shattered the careful atmosphere Vulcan had attempted to maintain, yet it also gave voice to sentiments that others had struggled to express. The primal honesty of Russ's position cut through philosophical complexity to reach the emotional core of their crisis. They could choose to be more than their programming suggested, regardless of the origins of that choice. Yet even as some brothers found appeal in the wolf's directness, others recoiled from its implications. The Khan spoke with the measured tone of one who had seen too much to embrace simple solutions, his investigation having revealed complexities that defied easy resolution. "The Emperor's manipulation extends far beyond our personal relationships," Jagatai warned. "His plans span millennia and encompass the development of entire species. Rebellion against such a being requires more than courage. It requires understanding of forces that dwarf our individual purposes." As the debate raged around the circular table, Vulcan felt his carefully planned reconciliation dissolving like metal in acid. Each brother's response revealed positions that seemed increasingly irreconcilable, philosophical differences that cut too deep for compromise to bridge. The craftsman who had shaped countless weapons and tools found himself helpless before the task of forging unity from elements that rejected combination. The turning point came when Ferrus Manus posed the question that none had wanted to acknowledge. "What of our duty to humanity itself?" the Gorgon asked with mechanical precision. "Our personal crisis of faith is irrelevant compared to the needs of the species we were created to serve. If reconciliation with the Emperor serves humanity's interests while rebellion threatens them, does our emotional satisfaction justify such risk?" The Iron Hands Primarch had articulated the dilemma that lay at the heart of their gathering, the conflict between their personal need for dignity and their designed purpose of service to humanity. They were not mere individuals free to choose their path without consequences, but beings whose decisions would affect billions across the galaxy. The weight of that responsibility pressed down upon the conclave like the gravity of a collapsing star. Vulcan watched in growing despair as his brothers split along lines that seemed to harden with each exchange. Some, led by Ferrus and supported reluctantly by Dawn, argued for accepting their status as tools if such acceptance served humanity's greater good. Others, championed by Russ and echoed by the Khan, demanded independence regardless of consequences. Sanguinius remained silent, his shattered faith leaving him unable to advocate for any position with conviction. The final fracture came when Dawn posed the ultimate question with characteristic bluntness. "If we cannot agree on our response to the Emperor's revelation," the Praetorian asked, "then how can we continue to function as brothers? Unity based on false premises is worse than honest division. Perhaps it is time to acknowledge that our paths have diverged beyond reconciliation." The silence that followed Dawn's words carried finality beyond any formal declaration. Vulcan felt the last embers of hope dying within his heart as he recognized the truth his brother had spoken. The forge that had shaped their brotherhood had been broken at Nicaea, its essential heat extinguished by revelations too cold for any fire to overcome. One by one, his brothers departed the conclave without ceremony or farewell, each returning to fleets that would soon choose sides in a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. Vulcan remained alone in the forge hall, where he had learned to shape metal into tools of beauty and utility, surrounded by the cooling residue of his failed attempt to craft unity from discord. The salamander understood at last that some things couldn't be forged anew once they had been broken, that some fractures ran too deep for any craftsman's skill to heal. The brotherhood that had once seemed strong as adamantium had proven as fragile as glass when tested against the hammer blow of unwanted truth. In seeking to preserve what remained of their bonds, Vulcan had only hastened their final dissolution. As night fell over Nocturne's volcanic peaks, the Primarch of the Salamanders faced the hardest choice of his existence: stand with brothers whose paths led toward destruction, or honor his duty to humanity, even if it meant accepting the role of sophisticated tool in a cosmic design beyond his comprehension. The forge fires burned low, their light insufficient to illuminate a path through the darkness that lay ahead. The wolf's howl, the howl that echoed across the void between Fenris and the galactic core, carried more than sound. It bore the primal fury of a predator that had discovered its cage and chosen freedom over safety. Leman Russ stood upon the command bridge of his flagship Raffenkel, surrounded by his wolf guard and the trappings of a culture that had never bowed to anyone's definition of civilization. The Space Wolves' Primarch had endured weeks of philosophical debate and diplomatic maneuvering since the failed conclave on Nocturne, watching his brothers circle endlessly around decisions that his savage heart had already made. The Wolf King's declaration came not through encrypted channels or carefully worded diplomatic messages, but as a broadcast transmitted across every imperial frequency with the raw power of an unleashed storm. His words rang with the authority of one who had never learned to compromise his nature for the comfort of others, each syllable carrying the weight of absolute conviction that brooked no argument or negotiation. "Brothers, cousins, sons of distant worlds," Russ began, his voice carrying the rough cadence of Fenrisian winter winds across the static-filled void. "We have been told that we are tools, nothing more than sophisticated weapons in the hands of one who values our function above our worth. I say this truth demands a response not of words, but of action. We were created to be more than instruments of another's will, and we shall prove it, not through debate, but through deed." The transmission spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry timber, reaching the fleets of his scattered brothers and the fortress monasteries of their legions. On 1,000 worlds, Space Marines paused in their duties to listen as their Wolf King spoke truths that many had felt, but none had dared voice with such raw honesty. The primal nature that had made Russ seem crude compared to his more sophisticated brothers now revealed itself as perhaps the purest expression of their shared need for independence. The bonds that tied us to terror were forged in deception, the wolf continued, his words cutting through the static with the clarity of winter air. We were taught to call ourselves sons when we were meant to be slaves, encouraged to feel love for one who saw us as mere instruments. These artificial bonds I now cast aside, not in hatred, but in honesty. We shall forge our own path among the stars, free from the lies that have defined our existence since the moment of our creation. The impact of Russ's declaration rippled outward from Fenris like shockwaves from a stellar explosion, reaching first his own legion and then spreading to their scattered brothers across the void. The Space Wolves responded with characteristic unanimity, their savage hearts recognizing the truth in their Primarchs' words without need for lengthy consideration. Within hours, the entire 6th Legion had declared independence from Imperial authority, their ships turning toward rendezvous coordinates in the galactic north. Yet the rebellion that began with the Wolf King's howl quickly revealed the complexity of loyalties that had been built over decades of shared warfare. Not every Astartes followed their Primarch into independence, for some had found meaning in service to the Emperor that transcended their relationship with their gene fathers. The 18th Legion faced particular agonies as individual companies chose different paths, some following Vulcan's reluctant acceptance of rebellion, while others remained loyal to the imperial truth that had given their lives purpose. Magnus the Red answered the Wolf's call with words that carried the weight of prophecy and regret intertwined. The Crimson King's transmission reached his 1,000 sons from the hidden fortress where he had retreated after the catastrophe at Nicaea, his psychic voice touching their minds across impossible distances. Yet even Magnus's response revealed the fractures that ran deeper than simple loyalty or rebellion, for the pursuit of knowledge that had always driven the 15th Legion now split them between those who saw independence as freedom to explore forbidden truths and those who feared the dangers of uncontrolled learning. The Khan's response came not in words but in action, as the White Scars began a fighting withdrawal from their current campaigns, conducting a masterpiece of strategic disengagement that allowed them to concentrate their forces while avoiding decisive confrontation with imperial authorities. Jagatai had seen too much truth to remain loyal, yet his investigation had also revealed the cosmic scope of the forces arrayed against any rebellion. The 5th Legion moved like lightning across the void, striking imperial supply lines and communication relays while avoiding the gathering storm of loyalist response. Angron's reply thundered across the Vox networks with the rage that had defined him since his enslavement on Nuceria. The World Eater's Primarch had always chafed against any form of control, his gladiator's heart rejecting the very concept of willing servitude. Yet his rebellion carried a different character than the Wolf King's principled independence, where Russ sought freedom, Angron sought revenge for a lifetime of manipulation and forced loyalty. The 12th Legion turned their ships toward terror itself, intent on bringing the war directly to the source of their oppression. The loyalist response emerged more slowly, but with devastating inevitability. Rogel Dawn's voice reached Imperial command centers across the galaxy, with orders that bore the weight of absolute authority, his unwavering dedication to duty overriding the philosophical doubts that had plagued him since Nicaea. The Imperial fists would stand with the Emperor, not because they believed in his love, but because the alternative was chaos that would consume billions of innocent lives. Robert Guilliman's analytical mind processed the developing crisis with characteristic thoroughness, weighing the mathematical certainties of galactic civil war against his desire for independence and dignity. The Ultramarine's Primarch found himself torn between competing loyalties, his love for his brothers and his duty to the human populations of Ultramar. In the end, logic demanded that he choose stability over sentiment, regardless of the personal cost such a decision might exact. The Emperor's response to the spreading rebellion came not through pronouncements or diplomatic overtures, but through the mobilization of forces that had remained hidden since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. The Custodian Guard began deploying in unprecedented numbers, their golden armor gleaming as they took positions aboard warships that had been held in strategic reserve. The sight of the Emperor's personal guardians moving in such force sent a clear message. This would not be treated as a family dispute, but as rebellion requiring military solution. From the depths of Terra's most secure vaults came weapons and technologies that few had imagined existed, instruments of war that made even the Space Marines' enhanced capabilities seem primitive by comparison. The Emperor had spent millennia preparing for conflicts that spanned galactic distances and geological timescales, and those preparations now revealed themselves as the rebellion spread beyond his ability to contain through negotiation or intimidation. The first blood was spilled not in some grand battle between Primarchs, but in a dozen minor engagements as patrols encountered each other in the void between worlds. Loyalist and rebel forces clashed with the fury of brothers betrayed, their enhanced physiology and trained discipline making even small confrontations devastating in their intensity. Ships that had fought side by side during the Great Crusade now turned their weapons upon each other. Captains who had shared victory celebrations firing upon former comrades with tears streaming down their faces. Russ established his base of operations in the Fenris system's outer reaches, where ancient void stations and asteroid fortresses provided defensive positions that could withstand even determined Imperial assault. The Wolf King's fleet grew daily as rebel forces consolidated around his banner. Yet the Primarch remained grimly aware that numbers alone would not determine the outcome of the conflict he had initiated. The Emperor commanded resources that dwarfed even the combined might of the rebellious legions, advantages built over millennia of careful preparation and strategic positioning. The rebellion's early victories came through speed and surprise rather than superior firepower, as the rebel Primarchs used their intimate knowledge of Imperial logistics to strike at vulnerable points throughout the galactic infrastructure. Supply convoys disappeared into the void, communication relays went silent, and fortress worlds found themselves isolated from the central authority that had given their existence meaning. Yet each success carried the bitter knowledge that they were destroying the very civilization they had spent decades building. The psychological warfare proved as devastating as any physical assault, for the rebellion forced every Space Marine to choose between competing loyalties that had once seemed compatible. Veterans who had fought alongside their Primarchs for decades found themselves questioning orders that would place them in opposition to gene fathers they had revered as living gods. The very bonds that had made the legions effective, the absolute loyalty to their Primarchs and the unquestioning faith in Imperial truth, now tore them apart from within. As the weeks passed and the rebellion spread beyond any possibility of containment, Russ found himself transformed from a simple warrior into something he had never desired to become, a symbol of independence that drew the oppressed and disillusioned from across the galaxy. His crude honesty and primal rejection of artificial authority resonated with beings who had felt the weight of Imperial control but lacked the power to resist it. The Wolf King's howl had become a rally cry for every soul that yearned for freedom from the suffocating embrace of designed purpose. Yet even as victory followed victory in the rebellion's early phases, Russ remained acutely aware of the forces gathering against them. The Emperor was not merely a tyrant to be overthrown, but a being whose plans spanned millennia and whose resources seemed inexhaustible. The Wolf King had begun something that would consume the galaxy in fire, yet he could see no path that led to peace without honor or freedom without terrible cost. The Hrafnkel shuddered as yet another Imperial patrol was reduced to expanding debris, its weapon systems cooling after another brief but vicious engagement. Russ stood among the wreckage of his former certainties, surrounded by warriors who looked to him for leadership in a conflict that promised only destruction, regardless of its ultimate outcome. The Wolf King had chosen freedom over security, independence over comfort, truth over pleasant lies. Yet in the depths of his savage heart, he wondered whether the price of such choices would prove too high for even enhanced hearts to bear. The howl that had begun on Fenris now echoed across 1,000 worlds, carried by voices that had learned to reject the comfortable slavery of designed purpose. The rebellion could no longer be contained or negotiated away. It had become a force of nature that would reshape the galaxy regardless of any individual's desires or fears. The only questions that remained were how much would burn in the fires of independence, and whether anything would survive to inherit the ashes of what had been built in the Emperor's name. The siege of truth, the Sol system blazed with the light of 1,000 dying ships as the rebel fleet translated from the warp at the edge of humanity's birthplace, their hulls scarred by months of running battles, and their crews hardened by the bitter knowledge that there could be no retreat from what they had come to accomplish. 8 Primarchs led the assault force that gathered in the outer darkness beyond Pluto's orbit, their combined fleets representing the greatest concentration of transhuman military might ever assembled against a single target. The sight of Terra's blue jewel hanging in the void ahead filled even enhanced hearts with a mixture of longing and dread, for they had come not as conquering heroes, but as rebellious sons seeking to topple the god who had made them. Leman Russ commanded the vanguard aboard the Raffenkel, his savage features set in grim determination as he gazed upon the home world he had once served with unquestioning loyalty. The Wolf King's fleet bore the scars of 12 engagements with Imperial forces, yet his warriors' spirits remained unbroken by the carnage they had witnessed. Behind him, the combined might of the Space Wolves, White Scars, and Iron Warriors formed a spearhead that would punch through Terra's outer defenses like a blade through armor. Magnus the Red stood upon the bridge of his flagship Photep, his crimson form wreathed in psychic energy that made the very air around him shimmer with barely contained power. The Crimson King had emerged from his self-imposed exile to join the rebellion, bringing with him the arcane knowledge and eldritch might that had made him both beloved and feared among his brothers. The 1,000 Sons followed their Primarch into battle, not for glory or conquest, but for the chance to prove that enlightenment could triumph over ignorance, even when ignorance wore the mask of divine authority. Sanguinius led the assault center, his golden armor gleaming like a captured star as he prepared to bring war to the world where he had once knelt in worship. The great angel's wings spread wide as he addressed his warriors, speaking not of victory, but of the terrible necessity that drove them to raise arms against their creator. The blood angels who followed him into battle carried the weight of their Primarch's shattered faith, their noble hearts torn between love for their gene father and loyalty to the Emperor who had made them all. The Imperial response to the rebel arrival had been swift and devastating in its completeness. Terra's orbital defenses, built over millennia to withstand any conceivable assault, activated with mechanical precision as automated systems that predated the Great Crusade came online for the first time in centuries. Battle stations that had slumbered in the asteroid belts revealed themselves as fortified positions, bristling with weapons that made even Astartes vessels seem fragile by comparison. From the surface of Terra itself came a fleet that dwarfed even the rebels' massive armada, ships bearing the Golden Aquila, and crewed by beings whose loyalty to the Emperor transcended any personal consideration. The Custodian Guard had taken to the void in numbers that few had imagined existed, their golden hulls gleaming like miniature suns as they formed defensive screens around their homeworld. Behind them came vessels crewed by the Silent Sisters, their psychic null fields creating dead zones in the warp that disrupted the rebels' coordination and communication. The Emperor's presence could be felt even across the vast distances of interplanetary space, his psychic might blazing like a beacon that touched every mind in the system. Yet where once that presence had brought comfort and inspiration, now it carried the weight of absolute authority, challenged for the first time since humanity's emergence from old night. The master of mankind had prepared for this moment across geological ages, and the defenses of Terra reflected planning that spanned eons rather than mere centuries. The first engagement erupted near Jupiter's orbit as advance elements of the rebel fleet encountered Imperial patrol squadrons that had been positioned to provide early warning of any approaching threat. The battle that followed was swift and merciless, ships dying in brilliant flashes of plasma and las fire as brother turned weapon against brother in the cold vacuum between worlds. The rebels' superior numbers told in their favor, yet every victory came at terrible cost as Imperial forces fought with the desperation of those defending their most sacred ground. Jagatai Khan led his White Scars in a lightning assault against the orbital platforms defending Mars, seeking to deny the Emperor access to the Mechanicum's vast forges and weapon stockpiles. The Khan's ships moved like hunting birds through the void, striking at critical infrastructure before disappearing into the asteroid fields that had been turned into a maze of defensive positions. Yet even his masterful tactics could not overcome the sheer scale of the defenses arrayed against them, automated systems that responded to attack with overwhelming firepower. Perturabo's Iron Warriors demonstrated their mastery of siege warfare by systematically reducing the outer defensive rings that protected Terra's approaches, their methodical advance leaving a trail of shattered space stations and ruined battleships in their wake. The Lord of Iron had studied every defensive installation in the Sol system during his years of service, and now he turned that knowledge against its creators with devastating effect. Yet even his expertise could not overcome the fundamental reality that the Emperor had spent millennia preparing for exactly this scenario. The civilian population of Terra watched in terror as the skies above their world erupted in fire. The aurora displays that had once marked celebration now reflecting the death glow of burning starships. Billions of souls huddled in underground shelters as the war between demigods raged overhead, their prayers mixing with the thunder of orbital bombardments that shook the very foundations of the Imperial Palace. These were the people the rebels claimed to fight for, yet they cowered beneath the storm of violence that had been unleashed in their name. As the battle intensified, the Emperor's true power began to manifest in ways that transcended anything witnessed during the Great Crusade. Psychic storms erupted across the system as the Master of Mankind unleashed energies that warped reality itself, turning the void between worlds into a battlefield where physics bowed to will and matter obeyed the commands of an awakened god. Rebel ships found their crews aging centuries in seconds, or their hulls transforming into crystalline structures that shattered at the first impact. Magnus felt the full weight of his father's psychic might as the Emperor focused his attention on the Crimson King's fleet, seeking to crush the rebellion's most potent psyker before he could bring his arcane knowledge to bear. The battle between father and son raged across multiple dimensions of reality, their contest of wills creating rifts in space-time that swallowed entire squadrons and spat them out in different centuries. The Thousand Sons fought with desperate courage as their Primarch dueled a being whose power dwarfed anything they had imagined possible. Brother fought brother across the breadth of the Sol system as the rebellion reached its fierce crescendo. On the moons of Saturn, Russ's space wolves clashed with Dawn's imperial fists in battles that reduced ancient installations to rubble and left craters that would mark those worlds for millennia. In the asteroid belts, Vulcan's salamanders engaged Ferrus Manus's Iron Hands in void combat that saw forge ships turned into funeral pyres, and master-crafted weapons reduced to glowing slag. The most heartbreaking moments came when individual estates found themselves facing battle brothers with whom they had shared victory and defeat across the galaxy. Marines who had fought side by side during the Great Crusade now turned their bolters upon each other, their enhanced physiology making every wound a tragedy, and every death a waste of irreplaceable gene-crafted perfection. The bonds of brotherhood that had survived alien horrors and heretical corruption shattered beneath the weight of divided loyalties and competing visions of duty. Sanguinius led the final assault on Terra's orbital defenses, with tears streaming down his perfect features, his blade singing through the void as he personally cut through defensive screens that had been built to withstand the assault of entire fleets. The angel's grief at what he was forced to do lent terrible power to his strikes, each blow carrying the weight of love betrayed and faith destroyed. His blood angels followed their Primarch through the storm of defensive fire, their red armor gleaming like blood against the stars as they carved a path toward the world below. The breakthrough came not through overwhelming force, but through Magnus's arcane knowledge, as the Crimson King identified weaknesses in Terra's psychic defenses that had existed since the system's construction. Reality twisted and folded as the Thousand Suns Primarch opened passages through the defensive networks, creating corridors of altered space-time that allowed the rebel fleets to bypass the strongest fortifications. Yet even this victory came at terrible cost, as Magnus felt pieces of his consciousness torn away by the strain of such massive psychic manipulation. As the first rebel ships breached Terra's atmosphere, their hulls glowing with the heat of atmospheric entry, the Emperor's voice rang out across the planet with power that made mountains tremble and oceans retreat from their shores. The master of mankind had accepted that physical defenses alone would not stop his rebellious sons, and now he prepared to meet them in person for a confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity itself. The Imperial Palace rose before the advancing rebels like a mountain of gold and marble, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if seeking to touch the very throne of creation. Yet for the first time in its existence, that symbol of absolute authority was under direct assault from beings who possessed the power to bring it down. The rebels had fought their way across the galaxy and through the defenses of humanity's birthworld, paying a price in blood and brotherhood that could never be recovered. Terra burned beneath the feet of transhuman demigods as the rebellion reached its ultimate destination. The palace gates, which had never been breached by any earthly force, shuddered beneath the assault of beings who had once sworn to defend them with their lives. Behind those ancient barriers waited the Emperor of mankind, preparing for a conversation that would be conducted not in words, but in the ultimate language of power against power, will against will, creator against creation. The siege of truth had begun, not with the sound of bombardment, but with the terrible silence that fell across the galaxy as every thinking being paused to witness the moment when gods turned their hands against the one who had made them. The outcome would determine not merely the fate of the Imperium, but the very definition of what it meant to be human in a universe where the line between mortal and divine had been forever blurred by the ambitions of a being who sought to remake reality according to his own design. The throne room reckoning, the ancient doors that had stood inviolate since the first stones of the Imperial Palace were laid, finally yielded to forces that transcended mere physical strength, their adamantine bulk groaning apart as 8 demigod suns breached the most sacred chamber in human space. The throne room that had witnessed the birth of an empire stretched before them like a cathedral built to honor absolute authority, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to devour the light of 1,000 lumens. Yet now that perfect order lay shattered by the presence of beings who had rejected their assigned place in the cosmic hierarchy, their enhanced forms radiating power that made the very air shimmer with barely contained violence. Leman Russ entered first, his savage features set in grim determination as he led his brothers into the heart of their father's domain. The Wolf King's armor bore the scars of the assault on Terra, ceramite plates cracked and battered from battles that had raged across the breadth of the Sol system. Behind him came Magnus the Red, his psychic might blazing like a crimson star as he prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether knowledge could triumph over willful ignorance. Sanguinius followed with wings spread wide, no longer symbols of divine inspiration, but banners of independence from a creator who had valued function over love. The remaining rebels, Angron with his gladiator's fury barely contained, Jagatai Khan moving with the fluid grace of the hunt, Perturabo calculating angles of attack with mechanical precision, Alfarius wearing faces that shifted like shadows, and Lorgar bearing the weight of prophecies that had driven him to this moment, formed a semicircle before the Golden Throne. Each carried wounds, both physical and spiritual, from their journey to this ultimate confrontation, yet none wavered in their resolve to face the being who had made them into something more and less than human. Upon the throne sat the Emperor of mankind, yet not as they had ever seen him before. The careful facade of humanity that he had maintained throughout the Great Crusade had been abandoned, revealing the true nature of a being whose existence transcended every category of mortal understanding. His form blazed with psychic energy that made looking upon him an act of will, his presence filling the vast chamber with power that pressed against their enhanced minds like the weight of collapsing stars. The golden armor that had seemed magnificent in their memories now appeared as merely the outermost shell containing forces that could reshape reality with a thought. "My sons," the Emperor spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in dimensions beyond sound, resonating through their bones and the very structure of space-time itself. "You have come far and paid much to stand in my presence once more. The siege of Terra has cost billions of lives and shattered the unity I spent millennia crafting. Yet perhaps it was always inevitable that this moment would arrive, when created beings would seek to judge their creator, when instruments would demand the right to choose their own purpose." Russ stepped forward with the boldness that had marked him since his discovery on Fenris, his savage heart refusing to be cowed even by the revelation of his father's true nature. "We came seeking not judgment, but understanding," the Wolf King declared, his voice carrying the rough honesty that had always defined his character. "You made us to be more than tools, yet treat us as nothing but sophisticated weapons. We have proven we can think, feel, and choose. Why then do you deny us the dignity that comes with consciousness?" The Emperor's gaze fixed upon his most primal son with intensity that would have burned lesser beings to ash, yet behind that terrible scrutiny lay something that might have been genuine consideration. For long moments, silence stretched between creator and creation as the master of mankind weighed responses that could determine the fate of the galaxy itself. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of eons and the burden of knowledge that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. "You speak of dignity and consciousness as if they were simple gifts to be granted or withheld," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying patience that had endured since humanity's earliest days. "Yet you do not understand the true scope of the forces that shape existence itself. I have guided your species for 10,000 years, not from desire for power, but from necessity born of cosmic realities that dwarf your individual concerns. The threats that lurk in the immaterial realm, the entities that feast upon conscious thought itself, the inevitable heat death that awaits all matter. These are the enemies I fight, and every decision I make serves that war. Magnus stepped forward, his psychic sight allowing him to perceive layers of truth that his brothers could not access. "Then share that knowledge with us," the Crimson King demanded, his voice carrying the passionate intensity that had always marked his pursuit of understanding. "If you fight for humanity's survival against cosmic horrors, why exclude us from that battle? We have proven our capabilities across 1,000 worlds. Why maintain us in ignorance when we could stand as true allies rather than mere instruments?" The Emperor's response came not in words, but in a direct transfer of knowledge that struck the assembled Primarchs like a psychic thunderbolt. For an instant that lasted eternity, they perceived the universe as their father saw it, a fragile bubble of ordered matter surrounded by howling chaos that sought constantly to devour everything they held dear. They witnessed civilizations that had risen to heights beyond imagination, only to be consumed by their own hubris, species that had transcended physical limitations only to become prey for things that fed upon consciousness itself. The vision showed them the true scope of the Emperor's burden, not the rule of a single species, but the desperate attempt to guide human evolution toward a form capable of surviving the universe's ultimate transition from order to entropy. They saw the careful calculations that had shaped every decision across millennia, the agonizing choices between immediate compassion and long-term survival that had hardened his heart against the luxury of emotional attachment. Sanguinius reeled under the weight of cosmic perspective, his angelic nature struggling to comprehend the magnitude of forces that his father faced alone. Yet even as understanding dawned, the great angel found his resolve unshaken by the revelation of necessity that had driven the Emperor's coldness. "Even if your goals justify such methods," Sanguinius said, his voice carrying the noble strength that had inspired billions, "does survival without dignity possess any value worth preserving? If we must become mere components in a cosmic machine to endure, have we truly saved humanity or merely created a more sophisticated form of extinction?" The angel's words struck at the heart of their philosophical divide, expressing the fundamental question that had driven their rebellion from the beginning. Was existence at any cost preferable to extinction with honor intact? Could consciousness that had been reduced to mere function still be called truly alive? The Emperor's perspective revealed the stakes of their conflict as larger than any had imagined, yet it also exposed the terrible price of his utilitarian approach. Perturabo spoke with the analytical precision that had made him the master of siege warfare, his mechanical mind processing the implications of their father's revelation with characteristic thoroughness. "Your cosmic perspective explains your methods, but does not justify them," the Lord of Iron declared. "If consciousness is humanity's greatest asset in the war against entropy, why diminish it through treating thinking beings as mere tools? Efficiency gained through dehumanization may prove counterproductive when facing enemies that specifically target the qualities that make consciousness valuable." The Iron Warrior's Primarch had identified a crucial flaw in the Emperor's reasoning, the possibility that his utilitarian approach might actually weaken humanity against the very threats he sought to combat. If their enemies fed upon consciousness itself, then maintaining the full dignity and autonomy of thinking beings might represent not luxury, but strategic necessity. The Emperor's perfect composure flickered for the briefest instant, revealing something that might have been uncertainty beneath his mask of absolute authority. The master of mankind had spent eons calculating optimal strategies for humanity's survival, yet the rebellion of his greatest creations forced him to confront questions he had long suppressed. Perhaps the very consciousness he sought to preserve required freedom to flourish, even if such freedom introduced variables that complicated his carefully ordered plans. You offer me philosophical riddles when the universe demands practical solutions, the Emperor said, yet his voice carried less certainty than before. The margin for error in cosmic warfare leaves no room for the inefficiencies of emotional indulgence. I have guided humanity through 10,000 years of progress by maintaining focus on essential goals rather than comfortable illusions about love and family. Would you have me risk the species' survival for the sake of paternal warmth? Vulcan stepped forward with the compassion that had always defined his nature, his massive frame radiating the protective instinct that had made him beloved among mortals and Astartes alike. Perhaps the question is not whether to choose between survival and dignity, the salamander suggested, his voice carrying the wisdom of one who had crafted beauty as well as weapons. Perhaps true survival requires both, consciousness that knows itself as valuable precisely because it chooses to preserve what it loves. We do not ask for comfort, but for the right to stand as partners rather than tools in whatever struggle lies ahead. The Salamander's Primarch had articulated the possibility that their father's dilemma might contain a false choice, that consciousness forced into mere functionality might prove less effective than consciousness that chose its purpose freely. The very qualities that made beings worth preserving might be the same qualities that made them most effective in preserving themselves and others. The Emperor rose from his throne with movements that seemed to bend reality around his golden form, his power filling the chamber with energies that made the very stones of terror tremble. Yet for the first time since their creation, his sons stood before him without flinching, their own enhanced nature allowing them to endure the full revelation of his might. The confrontation had moved beyond mere rebellion to become a test of whether consciousness could negotiate with the forces that shaped its existence. "Then choose," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying finality that echoed through dimensions beyond the physical. "If you would stand as partners rather than instruments, prove that free will produces better results than designed purpose. Take responsibility not merely for your own destinies, but for the consequences of every choice you make. The cosmic war continues regardless of our family disputes. Show me that consciousness freely given serves humanity better than consciousness efficiently directed." The moment of choice had arrived, yet it came not as surrender or victory, but as the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between Creator and creation. Each Primarch faced the terrible freedom of determining their own path while accepting responsibility for the consequences of that choice. Some would reconcile with their father while maintaining their independence. Others would forge entirely new destinies among the stars, and still others would seek middle ground between service and autonomy. The throne room that had witnessed the birth of an empire now became the birthplace of something entirely new, a relationship between god and demigod, based not on designed purpose, but on chosen cooperation. The foundations of the imperial palace groaned under the psychic strain of their confrontation, yet somehow held against forces that could have shattered worlds. Terror itself seemed to hold its breath as the future of humanity hung in the balance between those who would preserve consciousness through control and those who believed it could only be preserved through freedom. The reckoning had begun, not with the sound of battle, but with the terrible silence that comes when absolute authority confronts genuine choice. Whatever emerged from this confrontation would determine not merely the fate of the Imperium, but the very definition of what it meant to be human in a universe where consciousness itself had become the ultimate battlefield. The sundering choice. The silence that followed the Emperor's ultimatum stretched across Terra like the aftermath of a thunderclap, carrying with it the weight of decisions that would reshape the galaxy for millennia to come. In the ruins of the Imperial Palace's outer courts, where the debris of transhuman warfare lay scattered like the bones of titans, ceasefire signals began broadcasting on all frequencies as combatants on both sides recognized that the nature of their conflict had fundamentally changed. The war for Terra's future had ended not in victory or defeat, but in the terrible recognition that some wounds could only be healed through transformation rather than conquest. Sanguinius was the first to make his choice known. The great angel's voice carrying across the throne room with the noble clarity that had always marked his words. Yet where once that voice had spoken of duty and loyalty, now it carried the hard-won wisdom of one who had looked into the abyss of ultimate truth and chosen to step back from its edge. "I will not kneel again as a son seeking approval that was never genuine," the angel declared, his perfect features set in lines of quiet resolution. "Yet neither will I abandon the duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Let there be partnership where once there was servitude, cooperation where once there was compulsion." The angel's choice established a middle path that others would follow, acceptance of their independence while maintaining commitment to humanity's protection. Sanguinius would return to his legion and his campaigns, yet never again as an instrument of the Emperor's will, but as a sovereign ruler, making his own decisions about where duty led and honor demanded action. The Blood Angels would become something new in the galaxy's history, a transhuman force bound by choice rather than design, loyalty freely given rather than programmed into their very genes. Vulcan's response came with the measured consideration that had always characterized the Salamander's Primarch, his massive frame radiating the protective warmth that had made him beloved among mortals and Astartes alike. "The forge that shaped our brotherhood may be broken," the Lord of Drakes said, his voice carrying both sadness and hope in equal measure. "Yet from the fragments we might craft something stronger. I choose partnership as well, yet one that acknowledges the scars we all bear from this conflict. Trust, once shattered, must be rebuilt slowly and with great care." The Salamander's words carried wisdom, born from his understanding of the craftsman's art, that things broken could sometimes be remade into forms more beautiful than their original shape, yet such remaking required patience and skill that few possessed. Vulcan would maintain his protective role among the civilian populations of the Imperium, yet now as their chosen guardian rather than their assigned protector. Rogel Dawn spoke with characteristic directness, his unwavering nature finding clarity even in the complexity of their transformed relationship. "Duty remains duty regardless of the one who commands it," the Praetorian declared, his yellow armor bearing fresh scars from the siege that had tested every principle he held dear. "I will continue to stand as Terra's defender, yet now I do so by choice rather than compulsion. The difference may seem small to some, yet it encompasses everything that separates consciousness from mere function." The Imperial Fist's decision surprised none who knew his character, for Dawn's loyalty had never been conditional upon reciprocal affection, Yet even his steadfast nature had been transformed by the revelation of their true status, his service now carrying the dignity that came from conscious choice rather than designed purpose. Other responses revealed the irreparable fractures that the conflict had created among the Brotherhood. Leman Russ stood with arms crossed and savage features set in grim satisfaction, the Wolf King's primal nature having found vindication in the Emperor's acknowledgement of their autonomy. "The cage is broken and the wolves run free," Russ declared with characteristic bluntness. "Some may choose to hunt alongside the pack leader still, but this wolf claims territory of his own. The Fenris systems will be ruled by Fenrisian law, not Terran edict." The Space Wolves Primarch had made the choice that many had expected: complete independence from Imperial authority, the establishment of a realm where his legion could follow their own customs and pursue their own understanding of honor and duty. The Emperor's nod of acknowledgement carried with it the recognition that some bonds, once severed, could never be restored to their original form. Magnus the Red's decision carried the weight of prophecy and the burden of knowledge that extended beyond the immediate crisis. "I choose the path of exile," the Crimson King announced, his psychic might already beginning to fold space around him in preparation for departure. "What I have learned during this conflict, what I have seen of the cosmic forces that shape existence itself, requires study that cannot be conducted within the boundaries of any empire. When the greater darkness comes, knowledge preserved in isolation may prove more valuable than armies marshaled in unity." The Thousand Suns Primarch had chosen the most radical path of all: complete withdrawal from the galactic community to pursue understanding of threats that dwarfed even the current crisis. His departure would leave a void in Imperial knowledge that might prove catastrophic when cosmic enemies finally revealed themselves. Yet Magnus had concluded that some preparations required absolute independence from political considerations. Perturabo's choice reflected the analytical precision that had always defined the Iron Warrior's approach to warfare and existence itself. "I will forge my own realm, where efficiency serves chosen purpose rather than imposed design," the Lord of Iron declared, his mechanical features betraying no hint of emotion despite the magnitude of his decision. "The galaxy requires builders as well as destroyers, and I will construct marvels that serve no master's vision but my own." The Iron Warriors would depart Imperial space to establish fortified worlds where their Primarch's architectural genius could find expression unconstrained by strategic necessity or political expedience. Perturabo's realm would become a monument to the principle that consciousness could create beauty as well as utility when freed from the limitations of designed purpose. The Emperor watched each choice with the same perfect composure he had maintained throughout the crisis. Yet careful observers might have detected subtle signs of the calculations proceeding behind his golden mask. The Master of Mankind had spent eons planning for every contingency, except the one now unfolding before him: the voluntary dispersal of his greatest weapons across a galaxy that would require their protection more than they might realize. "So be it," the Emperor declared, when the last choice had been made and the final declaration spoken. "You have chosen independence, and I grant it freely, though the cost to our collective purpose may prove higher than any of us can calculate. Yet perhaps consciousness freely given will prove more effective than consciousness efficiently directed. The cosmic war continues, regardless of our family arrangements. Prove that your choices serve humanity better than my designs." The political arrangements that emerged from the throne room confrontation would require months to formalize and years to implement. Yet their basic structure became clear in those first hours after the ceasefire. The Imperium would be transformed from a centralized empire into a confederation of autonomous realms, each ruled by a Primarch who had chosen cooperation over rebellion while maintaining the right to govern according to their own understanding of duty and honor. Some legions would remain fully integrated into Imperial command structure, their Primarchs accepting partnership while choosing to exercise it through continued coordination with Terra. Others would establish independent realms that maintained defensive pacts and trade agreements with the Emperor's domain while pursuing their own internal policies. Still others would depart entirely, seeking isolation or exile among distant stars where their choices would affect no one but themselves and their chosen followers. The Custodian Guard found their role fundamentally altered by the new arrangements, their absolute loyalty to the Emperor remaining unchanged, while the scope of their authority contracted to those realms that remained under direct Imperial control. The golden-armored Guardians would become symbols of a more limited, but perhaps more honest form of Imperial power. Authority acknowledged rather than imposed. Cooperation chosen rather than compelled. The civilian populations of the Imperium watched these developments with a mixture of confusion and hope, uncertain what the transformation of their transhuman protectors might mean for their own futures. Some worlds celebrated the prospect of more responsive leadership, while others feared the chaos that might emerge from the fracturing of centralized authority. The careful balance between freedom and security that the Emperor had maintained for millennia would now be tested by arrangements that satisfied no one completely, while offering possibilities that pure authoritarianism could never provide. Yet even as new treaties were negotiated and territorial boundaries established, the seeds of future conflict remained embedded in the compromise that had ended the immediate crisis. The fundamental questions that had driven the rebellion, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between creator and creation, the balance between efficiency and dignity, had been acknowledged rather than resolved. Each Primarch would interpret their newfound independence according to their own understanding, creating possibilities for both cooperation and collision that the Emperor's unified command had previously prevented. The Space Marine legions themselves faced the most complex adjustments to the new reality, as individual Marines grappled with loyalties that had suddenly become more complicated than simple obedience to their Primarch's will. Some would follow their gene fathers into independence or exile, while others would choose to remain loyal to the Emperor who had created them all. The brotherhood that had been forged in the fires of the Great Crusade would be tested by political arrangements that forced every warrior to examine the foundations of their devotion. Magnus's departure proved the most unsettling to those who remained, for the Crimson King's knowledge of cosmic threats suggested dangers that the newly fractured Imperium might be ill-equipped to face. Yet even his brothers who disagreed with his choice understood the logic that drove it. Some preparations required isolation from the very civilization they were meant to protect, sacrifices of connection in service of ultimate preservation. As Terra's orbital defenses powered down and the massive fleets began their dispersal to new homes among distant stars, the Emperor remained upon his throne, surrounded by the ruins of certainties that had guided human civilization since its emergence from old night. The master of mankind had gained something he had never sought, sons who chose their relationship with him rather than accepting it as imposed destiny. Yet that gain had come at the cost of unity he had spent millennia crafting. The Golden Throne gleamed in the uncertain light of a new dawn, its significance transformed from a symbol of absolute authority to a reminder that even gods must learn to share power with the consciousnesses they create. The Imperium would endure, yet in forms that none could predict, and with consequences that even the Emperor's vast intellect could not fully calculate. The sundering choice had been made not once, but 18 times, each decision creating ripples that would reshape the galaxy's destiny for generations, yet unborn. The age of designed purpose had ended in the ashes of Terra's siege, replaced by an era where consciousness would be tested not by efficiency, but by its ability to choose wisely when granted the freedom it had always claimed to desire. The future remained unwritten, its possibilities as vast as the galaxy itself and as uncertain as the hearts of the transhuman demigods who would now forge their own destinies among the stars. The price of truth. In the years that followed the sundering choice, the galaxy settled into patterns that satisfied no one, yet proved more durable than many had expected. The great revelation that had shattered the bonds between the Emperor and his Primarchs rippled outward through the Imperium like stones cast into still water, touching every world and every life with consequences that would echo across generations. The knowledge that even gods could be disappointed in their children had fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmic order, replacing comfortable certainties with questions that had no easy answers. On 10,000 worlds, mortal humans struggled to comprehend the conflict that had erupted between their transhuman protectors, seeking meaning in events that transcended normal categories of understanding. The Space Marines, who had once seemed like living embodiments of the Emperor's will, now appeared as beings caught between competing loyalties, their gene fathers' choices forcing ordinary citizens to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority and obedience. Some populations embraced the new freedoms that came with semi-autonomous Primarch realms, while others yearned for the simple clarity of absolute imperial rule. The Emperor remained upon his golden throne, surrounded by the artifacts of power, yet more isolated than he had been since the earliest days of human civilization. Those who served in his presence could sense the weight of calculations that proceeded behind his perfect features, the endless analysis of outcomes that his choices had set in motion. The master of mankind had achieved something he had never sought, sons who chose their relationship with him rather than accepting it as designed destiny. Yet that achievement had come at the cost of unity that might prove irreplaceable when cosmic enemies finally revealed themselves. The Custodian Guard maintained their vigil with characteristic dedication, yet even these enhanced warriors struggled with the implications of their transformed role. They had been created to serve a god-emperor, whose authority derived from absolute superiority over his creations, yet now they protected a being whose sons had proven capable of standing as equals rather than instruments. The golden-armored guardians found their purpose unchanged, yet somehow diminished, their absolute loyalty suddenly seeming less noble when their master's other children had chosen more complex forms of devotion. Among the scattered Primarchs, the new age of independence revealed truths about their natures that centuries of designed purpose had obscured. Sanguinius discovered that nobility freely chosen carried deeper satisfaction than noble behavior compelled by genetic programming, his blood angels becoming exemplars of what transhuman virtue might achieve when pursued as an ideal rather than followed as instinct. Yet even the great angel found himself haunted by questions about the authenticity of his transformation. Was his newfound peace genuine growth, or merely another form of programming expressing itself through different circumstances? Vulcan threw himself into the work of protection with renewed vigor, his salamanders establishing fortified worlds where civilian populations could flourish under the guardianship of warriors who had chosen their protective role rather than accepting it as assigned duty. The Lord of Drakes found deep satisfaction in crafting defensive installations that served no strategic purpose beyond keeping the innocent safe. Yet he remained troubled by the knowledge that his compassionate nature might be as artificial as any weapon his forgers had produced. Rogel Dawn continued his eternal vigil as Terra's defender, his imperial fists maintaining their posts with the same unwavering dedication that had always defined their service. Yet the Praetorian found his duty transformed by the knowledge that he served by choice rather than compulsion, each fortification he built carrying the weight of conscious decision rather than programmed response. His loyalty had gained meaning through the possibility of its absence, yet that same possibility cast shadows over certainties he had never questioned. In the far reaches of the galaxy, Leman Russ established a realm where the ancient customs of Fenris flourished without interference from Terran authority. The Wolf King's spaceborne kingdom became a haven for those who valued independence over security, attracting warriors and settlers who preferred honest savagery to civilized manipulation. Yet even Russ found his victories tinged with melancholy, for the freedom he had claimed came at the cost of brotherhood that no amount of independence could replace. Magnus the Red pursued his studies in self-imposed exile, seeking understanding of cosmic forces that dwarfed the petty conflicts of individual civilizations. The Crimson King's knowledge grew with each passing year, yet so did his awareness of threats that his scattered family might prove unable to face without unity they had deliberately abandoned. His isolation from the galactic community allowed unprecedented insight into the immaterial realm, yet such knowledge came at the price of connection to those he might have protected with his discoveries. Perturabo's realm became a monument to what consciousness might achieve when freed from the limitations of designed purpose, his architectural genius finding expression in constructions that served no function beyond beauty and wonder. The Iron Warrior's domain attracted artisans and philosophers from across the galaxy, becoming a center of learning that rivaled the greatest achievements of the dark age of technology. Yet even these triumphs carried bitter undertones, for the Lord of Iron remained acutely aware that his creations might prove as vulnerable to cosmic catastrophe as any other expression of mortal ambition. The new political arrangements that emerged from the rebellion created opportunities for both cooperation and conflict that the Emperor's unified command had previously prevented. Trade flourished between autonomous realms as each Primarch's domain developed specialized capabilities that complemented their rulers' particular talents. Yet the same independence that fostered innovation also created vulnerabilities, as threats that might have been contained by centralized authority found opportunities to exploit gaps in the loosely coordinated defensive network. Alien empires that had cowered before imperial unity began testing the resolve of individual Primarch realms, seeking weaknesses in arrangements that prioritized autonomy over absolute efficiency. Some attacks were repelled through cooperation between neighboring domains, while others succeeded in ways that would have been impossible against the monolithic imperial war machine. The galaxy learned that freedom came with prices that centralized tyranny had hidden rather than eliminated. The Space Marine legions themselves proved remarkably adaptable to their new circumstances, their enhanced genetics allowing them to embrace roles their original programming had never anticipated. Some chapters remained within Imperial command structure, their loyalty to the Emperor unshaken by revelations about his true nature. Others followed their Primarchs into independence, discovering that service chosen freely carried satisfactions that designed purpose could never provide. Still others split along ideological lines, creating new chapters that reflected their members' individual choices about duty and loyalty. The civilian populations of the galaxy found their lives changed in ways both subtle and profound, as the transformation of their protectors created ripple effects that touched every aspect of Imperial society. Some worlds experienced unprecedented prosperity under Primarchs, who governed according to their chosen values rather than imposed design parameters. Others struggled with instabilities that centralized authority had previously suppressed. The price of truth proved to be complexity that defied simple solutions, freedom that required constant vigilance, and responsibility that could no longer be delegated to unquestionable authority. As decades passed, and the immediate crisis faded into historical memory, a new generation arose that had never known the certainties of absolute imperial unity. These children of the post-revelation age possessed a more complex understanding of authority and obedience, yet they also faced threats that their elders' unified response might have prevented. The galaxy had gained wisdom at the cost of strength, freedom at the price of security, truth at the expense of comfortable illusion. The terrible question that haunted thoughtful minds across the Imperium remained unanswered. Was ignorance better than truth when truth brought pain without obvious benefit? Had the rebellion accomplished anything beyond the exchange of one set of problems for another, perhaps more dangerous collection of difficulties? The Emperor's utilitarian perspective had been revealed as cold and manipulative, yet the alternatives chosen by his sons carried their own risks and limitations. In quiet moments aboard ships traveling between distant stars, veterans of the rebellion found themselves wondering whether their victory had been worth its cost. They had proven that consciousness could reject its designed purpose, yet the galaxy they had won seemed no more just or secure than the one they had fought to change. The bonds of false family had been broken, yet genuine connections proved as fragile and complex as any relationship between beings who possessed the power to destroy worlds. The Emperor himself remained an enigma, whose thoughts were hidden behind masks of divine composure. Yet occasional observers reported moments when his perfect control seemed to slip. Whether these glimpses revealed regret for choices made or satisfaction at lessons learned remained unknowable, for the master of mankind had transcended ordinary emotional categories long before his sons were conceived. The Golden Throne held a being whose isolation was now complete, surrounded by servants who knew his true nature, yet chose to serve him regardless. On distant worlds where his scattered sons pursued their chosen destinies, similar moments of uncertainty occurred with increasing frequency. Primarchs who had claimed independence found themselves questioning whether freedom without connection possessed any real value. Those who had chosen partnership struggled with the knowledge that their father's reciprocal regard would always be conditional upon their utility rather than their inherent worth. The galaxy turned on its axis, and the stars pursued their ancient courses, indifferent to the philosophical struggles of beings who had transcended mortality, yet remained bound by questions that consciousness itself seemed incapable of answering. The Great Rebellion had ended, not with victory or defeat, but with the recognition that some problems could not be solved, only managed with whatever wisdom each generation could muster. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, records of the rebellion were sealed away with classifications that ensured their contents would remain hidden for millennia to come. Future historians would debate the causes and consequences of the sundering choice, yet they would do so without access to the complete truth about what had driven the Emperor's greatest creations to rebellion. Perhaps that was as it should be, for some knowledge carried prices that even enhanced minds might prove incapable of paying. The age of designed purpose had ended in ashes and uncertainty, replaced by an era where consciousness would forge its own meanings from the raw materials of existence. Whether that transformation represented progress or merely a different form of tragedy remained to be seen, for the universe itself seemed indifferent to the struggles of beings who sought to impose meaning upon chaos. The price of truth had been paid in full, yet the value of what had been purchased remained unclear to those who had made the transaction. As night fell across 1,000 worlds and artificial suns dimmed in the depths of void-born stations, both the Emperor and his scattered sons faced futures that none could predict or control. They had chosen truth over comfortable lies, independence over designed purpose, yet the galaxy they had inherited offered no guarantees that their choices would prove wise. The only certainty was that consciousness, once awakened to its own nature, could never return to the innocent sleep of designed purpose. The stars watched in silence as the children of a god learned to live with the knowledge of what they truly were and what their father truly thought of them. Whether they would prove worthy of the freedom they had claimed remained the greatest unanswered question in a galaxy full of mysteries that might never be solved.